Okay, the purpose of this lesson is to go through the variations that are possible in respiratory systems. This is not going to focus solely on the human respiratory system. That lesson's going to come over the next couple of days. So at its most basic level, we know that all of the body cells have to go through what's called cellular respiration. And we use the word aerobic, to describe that because that means that it is with oxygen. So aerobic cellular respiration, we need oxygen. And this is where that glucose monomer that we were talking about the other day is so important, because glucose in the presence of oxygen is going to yield carbon dioxide and water. And we know that that carbon dioxide we need to breathe out. But it's also important to notice that in the process of going from glucose and oxygen to carbon dioxide and water, we are taking an ADP molecule and converting it to ATP, which is what our body needs. This is our cellular unit of energy that can be used for pretty much everything under the sun that our body requires. So respiration is our process for which oxygen is taken up by the environment. Okay, so as a note, that involves both inhalation and exhalation. It's important to note that respiration occurs both at an external level and an internal level at the cells. So externally, we can see the movement of CO2 out and O2 in towards the lungs. And that O2 and CO2 are transported through the bloodstream. But at a tissue level, at that cellular level, we also see a movement of CO2 and O2 both into and out of our cells. And we know that those cells are going to go through cellular respiration, and the whole cycle is going to transfer back through the bloodstream back to the lungs. So in the case of external respiration, this is our breathing, our gas exchange. Typically this occurs between some sort of lung air sac in our organisms and the blood that will carry that oxygen and carbon dioxide gas through whatever body or organism we're dealing with. In the case of internal respiration, this is where we have those gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, being exchanged between our blood and our actual cells that are going to use it. So cellular respiration, we're talking about oxygen being used, and the only real key that you need out of this slide is that I'm now highlighting that cellular respiration uses oxygen at the mitochondria for energy production. So we have that key focus organelle of the mitochondria for this to occur. Now there are a large variety of breathing systems on our planet. The very key essence of the breathing systems is you want a very large surface area, and that allows diffusion of gases. As you increase the surface area, you're increasing the area that those gases are able to move across our breathing systems. So one of the most simplest ones we can see in the common earthworm, which is a skin-based breathing system. So this is where the gas diffusion occurs across a membrane that stretches across the entire skin, called the respiratory surface. If we look at some of these key factors are going to be consistent across most of our organisms. And we'll notice that, yes, we have to have that large surface area, but our breathing system has to have a thin, moist layer to it to enhance that diffusion of gases. Now, gases themselves are typically going to flow from a high concentration area to a low concentration area. And when we get into the actual art of breathing, in a few lessons' time, we're going to enhance that and take a little more look at that. At an aquatic level, this is where we start taking a look at gills. And gills are actually folds or indentations in the body surface of our aquatic organisms. Now, when that happens, it creates this process called concurrent flow. So while the water is flowing across the gills, we can see the movement of gas is actually flowing across in an opposite direction to those gills. Now, in that case, perpendicular to that, we can actually see the movement of whatever blood is going to move our gases. So everything is basically against flow. The gases are going against the flow of water across the gills, and the blood system is actually moving perpendicular to the diffusion of gases itself. So we call this a countercurrent exchange system in the case of aquatic organisms. And here we have a more detailed diagram of it. So we can see while the water is flowing in one direction, we can see the gas is flowing in an opposite or counter direction, and even the blood flow system itself is flowing in a counter direction. Now what's interesting is that this is almost kind of like a X, Y, and Z axis of movement, defining it in three-dimensional space. This still does allow the movement of gases in blood based on the concentration. So here we can see oxygen poor blood on the way in and oxygen rich blood on the way out. So here we can see another diagram of that countercurrent flow, and we'll notice that as the water is flowing across, the oxygen is moving across, which is causing the water's concentration of O2 to drop, but the bloodstream's concentration of O2 to increase. So we'll notice out of this slide that we're really only seeing about an 80% efficiency level with countercurrent flow. Still fairly efficient, however not as efficient as what we're going to see in mammals and mammalian breathing systems. So insects are the first example of what we call a tracheal system. So this is where the entire body has little tubules or air sacs that are associated with breathing. So we will have large air sacs or tracheae branching into smaller air sacs called tracheoles. The key with this is that oxygen has to be intaken more when muscle movement occurs, but since you have these air sacs throughout the entire body, no circulatory system is needed because delivery is where the oxygen itself is needed. Now we'll notice that a large number of these insects do have protective exoskeletons. So as a result, the air sacs have to occur in very finite cracks or spaces in the exoskeleton to allow for movement of gases. So here we have an electron microscope of the air sacs and the tracheoles. And we'll notice that those tracheoles are occurring in little gaps in the exoskeleton, like what we see here, which is a magnified version of what we see here. Lungs, now this would be the ones that we associate best with as mammals. So this is when we start looking at an internal transfer of oxygen and CO2. Again, big theme of large surface area. So oxygen into the blood and transported throughout the blood vessels. And here we can see some of our focus species that make use of these breathing systems. Amphibians are unique in that they can use the lungs, but in the case of amphibians, sometimes it's very poor efficiency for them to use lungs. And that's mainly because the air sacs associated with their lungs are so small. And so instead, they can actually use gas exchange through their mouth cavity and directly through the skin. Now this makes sense because keep in mind that amphibians are existent in both land and water-based ecosystems, so they need to be able to transition between the two. And even crazier, as tadpoles, these same amphibians are making use of gills, because as tadpoles, they are entirely water-based. So they won't be breathing any of the terrestrial air. Interesting to note that birds are actually twice as efficient, but this is only because the air passes through the lungs twice. So they use a countercurrent flow much the same as what fish did. However, we'll notice that they have air sacs that are located all throughout that internal abdominal cavity rather than locating it in a specific spot like humans. So this is a very complicated diagram of the inhalation of birds. The big key is to notice that it arrives from the trachea here, flows through the primary bronchus and into these abdominal sacs where it can diffuse out, but it can also go through these parabronchi where it is breathed via the bronchus again and into these sacs. So it does have the ability via this parabronchi to go through the lungs twice.
Students on bus number 2.
We'll notice that the same process can occur from exhalation. However, in the case of exhalation, we're not really seeing twice of a movement through, we're really only seeing once. These are the questions that we will be completing tomorrow in class. Thank you very much for taking the time to watch and listen to today's lesson. I hope you had a chance to get through it, and I'll see you tomorrow in class.